Hey guys, so I want to do a book talk on American Epic, The Story of the American Indian by Alice Marriott and Carol K. Rachlin. This was published in 1969. Marriott and Rachlin were anthropologists at Oklahoma State University, and this book purports to be a work of ethno-history about Native American nations. And it really is just that, a very straightforward account of what we can know of the history and cultures and ways of life of many Native American nations, going from thousands of years before Europeans came to the present the present time by the standards of when this was published, so up to the 1960s. And it's divided into three sections, and the first section, and the section that I found most interesting, was a discussion of just the history of the people who came to the Americas. So it goes through the land bridge, the land bridge between Alaska and Russia, where people are hypothesized to have come over. It discusses many cultures and civilizations that collapsed before Europeans ever came, and many of those civilizations, the ones that collapsed hundreds or thousands of years ago, are civilizations that sort of were the ancestors of the nations that were around when Europeans came. And it just discusses their ways of life and their cultures and like different sort of like crafts that they were adept at, like the pottery that they made and weavings that they did and things of that sort. And that first section also moves into discussing a lot of nations that were around when Europeans came, like the Hopi and the Sioux and the Cherokee and many others. The second section of this book is about European invasion and the subjugation of Native Americans, primarily with a focus on the United States. This book really is focused on Americans in the U.S. It doesn't really talk much about Canada or certainly Central or South America. And so it goes through, what you would expect in an account like this of the Plains Wars, the Trail of Tears, the sort of forced removal of many Native Americans to reservations by the United States, and just everything that we associate with the history of America's relationship with Native Americans. And then the third and the shortest section is a bit about sort of contemporary issues with Native Americans, talking a little bit about the civil rights movement of Native Americans that was developing around the time that this book was published, which was called the American Indian Movement, and a little bit about contemporary Native American culture and arts and literature that was starting to blossom at the time. This was published in 1969, so around the time when the Native American Renaissance was taking place, and this Renaissance was sort of a time of flowering of a lot of literature and poetry and music made by Native Americans after a long time of sort of them just trying to get back on their feet after being forced onto reservations and subjugated and in brutal wars with the United States. So that's just a brief overview of the subject matter that this goes through. I have very mixed feelings about the book on the whole. So I want to go through just my thoughts on the different sections of the book. Just as an overall assessment, this book is not long. It's about 230 pages, and yet it covers a lot. It really does. It goes over a vast area. It discusses many different Native American cultures. Discusses the Spanish relationship with Native Americans in the Southwest when conquistadors first invaded. It goes through the United States relationship with Native Americans. It discusses boarding schools. The notorious boarding schools for Native Americans that cropped up in the 20th century. So it covers a lot of content in a short area, and I think that's indicated by the sort of concise writing that they have. The writing in here is very clear and concise, and it made it for a very easy reading experience. The first part of this book, the part where it was just talking about the different cultures and what we can know of their history and things of that sort, was very interesting. I zipped through that part just because I was super interested to learn about Native American cultures that were here before Europeans came, and to learn more about the nations that were here when Europeans came. And I just learned a lot of fascinating things. For example, at least at the time that this book was published, it was hypothesized that all of the cultures in North America were descended from one main culture, which is just called the archaic culture. And evidence of this archaic culture has been found at every geographic point in the United States. So at some point during history, this culture lived in every area of the U.S. And so that's why it's hypothesized that all the other cultures that emerged are descended from it. I was a little bit skeptical of that claim, just because it seems like the number of cultures in the U.S. are so varied and diverse that it seems unlikely they would all be descended from the same culture. But then I did, when I thought about it a bit more, think, if you look at the Indo-European speaking cultures that are in the world, which are as diverse as, from Europe, pretty much all of Europe, to much of India and Iran and other places, if you look at how diverse that big group of people is, then they were all also probably descended from a Proto-Indo-European culture that lived in the Caucasus. So if they can be descended from one, sort of proto-culture, then it might stand to reason that the same could be true of a lot of the cultures in the Americas. But that being said, one of my main concerns reading the book was whether scholarship since 1969 has progressed, and perhaps this theory of the archaic culture has gone out of fashion. I'm not sure. I can't know. I want to read more. So, but yeah, just a little caveat. But I found that section very interesting regardless. I learned a lot of things about cultures that are extinct and cultures that were here, just a lot of fascinating things about the social structures and cultures of these different nations. And for example, just one example is I learned about the Hopi Nation, who are sort of in the American Southwest, similar to the Pueblo Nation. I had heard of them, but I didn't know that much about them. And they had just a really fascinating social structure with regard to gender relations that I haven't heard about. That seems very unique in terms of the cultures that I'm familiar with. Because in the Hopi Nation, the men are the leaders, and the men are the warriors and the hunters. And so men obviously have a lot of status, but women also hold a lot more power in the Hopi Nation than maybe in a lot of other older cultures, certainly than in a lot of European cultures. The women were the heads of the households. The lineages were tracked through the female line, and the mother was the central figure in the household. And actually, something that I thought was particularly interesting was that the main sort of male figure in a household, to go along with the mother, wasn't actually her husband. It was her oldest brother, who would be the sort of enforcer for her children and the father figure, and the husband was primarily a member of his mother's family. So yeah, I just thought that learning things like that was just absolutely fascinating, and I liked that first section. The section about the subjugation of Native Americans after the coming of Europeans was fine. It covered, basically what you would expect. The Trail of Tears, when the Cherokee and Creek and many other nations who were on the East Coast were forcibly moved out to Oklahoma to be put on reservations in conditions that were just horrible, with very little food, very little water, disease running rampant in these treks that they were forced on, which is why it was called the Trail of Tears. It covers the Plains Wars a little bit, not as much as you would expect, which was kind of strange. I guess maybe the authors thought that maybe that the Plains Wars were covered well in other places, which I suppose they have been. But yeah, I guess my main reservation with that section was that there was a lot of European perspective and not very much actual Native American perspective on these things. All of the first-hand accounts they cite are by Europeans, and all of the historical characters that we learn of who play a part are white. We don't really learn the names of any particular Native American historical figures at any point in this book, actually. And I just thought that was very strange, because there were a lot of great Native American leaders who were, obviously played huge parts in their own history, and it just seems odd that the authors never really discuss, people like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and Tecumseh, and they do briefly mention Tecumseh, but it's like one sentence. So I thought that was very strange too. But that being said, they clearly have a lot of sympathy for the Native Americans and what happened to them. And actually, a passage I want to read is one where they give one of the best and heartbreakingly best descriptions of the Americans' policy toward Native Americans and subjugating them. And so this is what they write. Make treaties. The number is astronomical. And when the land is legally secure in white man's hands, develop it, and make more treaties. The process could, apparently, be continued ad infinitum. There was always land and more land, and all it took was another piece of paper to secure what the Englishmen wanted. In the last analysis, it was not the dour dominance of the Spaniards or the blithe laissez-faire of the French that shaped the course of North American Indian history. It was the brush aside and override, divide and conquer agriculturalism of the English. And yeah, that's just a perfect description of the United States' policy toward Native Americans. And also touches on something interesting. Another interesting thing that I learned here was the sort of contrast between America's policy toward Native Americans and the Spanish policy, because the Spaniards obviously had a huge empire in the Americas, and the French policy, because the French and the Spanish were much more sort of hands-off. They were much more interested in extracting resources more than really settling or driving out the Native Americans and having their own people live there. But the United States, who were the successors to the English essentially, wanted people to move there and wanted to, make room for their own citizens to live there, and that is the foundation for a lot of the atrocities that were committed by Americans. Not that the French and Spanish were guiltless. I mean, they did bad things as well, but still, their form of rule sort of made for less of an intrusive history toward Native Americans, I suppose. But anyway, my big issue with this book comes when the authors discuss Indian boarding schools. So, many Americans may know this. I assume a lot of Canadians know it, but anyone else who maybe doesn't, there was a system of, now notorious system of boarding schools for young Native Americans, where they were sent by the American government, essentially, to dress like white people, act like white people, they were forced not to speak their own language. They were often sent to foster homes with white families. They were not allowed to see their home or where they came from or their own nation while they were in these boarding schools. These boarding schools were often in the east of the United States, whereas a lot of the reservations are out west. These were hotbeds of physical and sexual abuse. Actually, another book that I can recommend where the author talks about this a decent amount is Mary Bravebird, or Mary Crowdog, as she's sometimes known, wrote a memoir called Lakota Woman, where she talks about her experience in a boarding school. And so these boarding schools were just horrendous, and thankfully they have been done away with since this time, certainly since the time when this book was published. But what really troubles me is that these authors seem to show a lot. They're too generous to the boarding schools. I think that they show a weird amount of sympathy towards them. So what they write of them is so this is what they write about the boarding schools at one point. They were a refuge from economic insecurity, an opportunity to learn to compete squarely with non-Indians, and a chance to observe ways of life that were different from their own, they being the Native American students. And it's crazy because they say that, and yet they also do cover a lot of the abuses that were committed in these schools. Excuse me. They do cover them very well. And so it's just weird to me that they would defend them in that way. Because that's just one sample. The guy who started the system of Indian boarding schools was a guy named Richard Henry Pratt. And they write about Richard Henry Pratt that he engendered devotion and loyalty among his students by his absolute fairness and impartiality. Rigid disciplinarian though he was basically a kind and fair man with a great human warmth. And I mean, I just don't believe that. If he can start a system like this, then I don't believe that he had very much human warmth. Because this was a system that was meant to engage in cultural extermination, essentially, and just led to a horrible amount of trauma for a lot of young people. And yeah, so that's my main issue with this book, which troubles me, and also I have to say, it really made me question the legitimacy of the rest of the book. If they're showing this much sympathy for these schools, can I trust anything else they say? So yeah, that's too bad. And I think Crystal of BiblioAtlas did raise a good point in a comment, where she said that perhaps because this was published in 1969, perhaps the abuses of the boarding schools were not fully sort of public, fully known. So perhaps they just didn't know. So that is a possibility, but yeah, I think perhaps this is a book of its time in that way, as well as, you know, when I was talking about the scholarship that may have been done since then and other things. I think this is a book of its time, and so it was good as a brief introduction to a lot of cultures. Like I said, the first part I really liked, but the rest of it was lacking in detail, lacking in a Native American perspective, and I think a bit too generous to at least one large part of the atrocities committed against Native Americans. So yeah, anyway, that's my thought on this book. I think it's out of print, so I don't know if you'll even be able to find it. I think I did find a mass market paperback edition for sale on Amazon, used, but yeah. So anyway, those are my thoughts. If anyone has thoughts on this book, if they've read it, or thoughts on these issues, if you've read more books than me about it, then I would really love to hear. If you have recommendations for other books that sort of cover a similar subject area, that maybe are more current, more up-to-date, then I would also love to hear. And yeah, anyway, so that's American Epic, and I hope you all found this video interesting. I don't know if anyone could enjoy a video about a topic like this necessarily, but anyway, I will talk to you all in my next video, and thank you for watching. I'm losing my voice, so I'm gonna go have a glass of water. Bye now.